Eugenie Sage.
Mr Speaker, kia ora koutou. Thank you. Well, I think the Minister's speech talking about getting the job done, I didn't hear the environment mentioned once. This government's economic policy, which focuses on short-term extractivism, is not building a long-term sustainable future for New Zealanders or the New Zealand economy. And I'd like to talk today about our Indigenous plants and wildlife, because they are some of our most significant and special features. They're a result of our long and isolated evolution and the diversity of our plant and seascapes. We are a global hotspot for biodiversity in New Zealand because we have so many species that are found here and nowhere else in the world. We've got very high levels of endemism. All of our skinks and geckos are only found in New Zealand. More than 90% of our insects, a quarter of our plants, and about a quarter of our birds, and 80% of our higher plants. Half a dozen islands in the Hauraki Gulf have got higher levels of endemism than all of Great Britain. Yet we have a biodiversity crisis with far too many species threatened with extinction, and this government is doing far too little about it. We have the Minister of Conservation sitting in the front row, head down, failing to invest adequately in DOC funding to protect our special places on conservation land, to protect our threatened species. Conservation funding cut by $7 million this year for natural heritage management. It's failing to ensure that the law is enforced properly, whether it's the Forest Act or the RMA. It's a government that proposes to change the Resource Management Act to weaken nature and strengthen private property rights. Mr Speaker, the treaty bills that we addressed in this House this morning sought to redress some of the gross injustices of the colonial era and the harm that the Crown allowed to be done to Māori and to their treaty rights. But we are still harming the first inhabitants of these lands, Ruru, Kaka, Manuka, Kauri. And what we need is stronger law and much greater investment in conservation and a complete change from this government's agenda of short-term extractivism. Because under the Resource Management Act, we have the protection of the natural character of wetlands, the protection of significant Indigenous vegetation and significant habitats of Indigenous fauna recognised as matters of national importance. Yet what do we have in Northland? The plundering of wetlands for ancient swamp kauri. We have the peat mining operation in Kaimomo wetland, and we have the government failing to provide guidance to councils on how these legal responsibilities should be applied. There was work done on a national policy statement on Indigenous biodiversity. That stopped under this government in 2011. After public submissions, the Minister stopped it. Why? Because he said there were issues including the impact on private landowners. Once again, government putting the interests of private landowners first. 3 years later, the government's decided to restart that work. But I'm not confident that we will get better protection for our special native plants and wildlife under any national guidance from this government, because what we're seeing in the National Environmental Standard for Plantation Forestry, which has been released recently. Forestry is a major export earner, but it occurs in areas where there can be significant environmental impacts, and this NES on plantation forestry is a missed opportunity to encourage a smart, sustainable forest industry in the long term while protecting our natural environment. It promotes afforestation at the expense of our Indigenous species. It's got a very permissive regime which allows areas of tussock grasslands and shrublands to be overplanted with exotics, except in areas that councils have specifically identified as significant in their plan. Forest and Bird has called it woefully inadequate in the way it deals with the protection of wetlands and high conservation value areas. It's inadequate too in terms of the way it deals with riparian buffers. They are well recognised in safeguarding waterways, yet it's proposing only 5-metre buffers around smaller streams and around wetlands. This government claims that it's providing national guidance, but what it does is provide guidance that strengthens the rights of private landowners and doesn't adequately recognise our distinctive biodiversity, our important landscapes, and protect them so that we ensure that a strong economy is based on strong environmental foundations.